The room went dead silent when the city's most arrogant billionaire tried to have his penniless black ex-wife thrown out of the Pierre Hotel gala. He expected her to cry. He didn't expect the doors to blow open, revealing the ruthless head of the Korean syndicate, who simply called her wife. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel in New York City was a sea of bespoke tuxedos, million-dollar diamonds, and inherited arrogance. It was the annual Winter Charity Gala, an exclusive playground where Wall Street titans, tech billionaires, and old money dynasties gathered to drink Krug Clos d'Ambonnet champagne and pretend they cared about the world. To get a seat at one of the Baccarat crystal-adorned tables required a minimum donation of $250,000. For 2 years, Naomi had actively avoided this specific circle of Manhattan's elite, not because she was afraid, but because it reminded her of a past life she had violently shed. She stood near the grand arched windows overlooking Central Park, the city lights catching the deep, flawless melanin of her skin. She wore an unbranded, custom-draped emerald green gown that clung perfectly to her curves, paired with a simple but blindingly clear diamond tennis bracelet. She looked breathtaking, completely at ease, as she took a slow sip of sparkling water. From across the room, Richard recognized her. Richard Belmont was a third-generation real estate heir. He was the kind of man who believed his last name was a skeleton key to the universe. 2 years ago, he had discarded Naomi in a brutal, highly publicized divorce. He had employed a team of ruthless corporate lawyers from Skadden Arps to enforce a predatory ironclad prenup, leaving her with absolutely nothing. He had dragged her name through the mud, painting her in the tabloids as a manipulative gold digger from Brooklyn who couldn't handle the pressures of high society. A month after kicking her out of their penthouse, he married Victoria, a blonde, blue-eyed heiress whose father owned half the commercial real estate in Boston. Richard squinted, his grip tightening on his crystal tumbler. He blinked, assuming the dim, amber lighting of the ballroom was playing tricks on him. But it wasn't. It was Naomi. A cruel, smug smile crept across his face. He nudged his new wife, Victoria, who was busy adjusting her heavy Cartier Panther necklace. "Look who crawled out of the woodwork," Richard sneered, nodding toward the windows. Victoria let out a short, high-pitched laugh. "Is that Naomi? What on earth is she doing here? Did she get a job on the catering staff?" "Let's go find out," Richard said, his ego practically vibrating with the anticipation of humiliating her all over again. He had spent the last 2 years convinced that Naomi was living in a cramped studio apartment, struggling to pay off the legal fees he had drowned her in. Seeing her here, in his territory, felt like a personal insult. Naomi sensed him before she saw him. The heavy scent of Tom Ford, oud wood, the same cologne he always oversprayed, wafted into her space. "I have to admit, I'm shocked," Richard's voice boomed, loud enough to turn the heads of the surrounding socialites. "I thought the security at the Pierre was impenetrable. Yet here you are, sneaking into a $250,000 a plate dinner." Naomi turned slowly. Her dark, expressive eyes met his pale blue ones. There was no flinch, no lingering heartbreak, and no intimidation, just profound, chilling indifference. "Hello, Richard," she said softly, her voice smooth and unbothered. "Victoria, that Cartier piece is lovely. A bit heavy for your neckline, but lovely." Victoria flushed a deep, angry crimson, her hand defensively flying to her throat. Richard stepped closer, invading Naomi's personal space in an attempt to tower over her. "Don't try to play polite with us, Naomi. I know exactly what you're doing. You're hunting. You found out I was going to be here, and you rented some cheap dress to try and bag another rich husband." He laughed darkly, glancing around to ensure they had an audience. Several wealthy guests, including a prominent hedge fund manager and a local senator, were now openly staring, eavesdropping on the drama. "I'm not hunting, Richard," Naomi replied, taking another elegant sip of her water. "I'm just enjoying the view." "The view?" Richard scoffed, his voice rising in volume. He wanted to break her. He needed to see the desperate, broken woman he had thrown out 2 years ago. "You don't belong here. You never belonged here. When we were married, you were nothing but a charity project. I got tired of funding. You have zero pedigree, zero wealth, and zero class. Whoever you slept with to get through the service elevator tonight is going to be very disappointed when I have you thrown out onto Fifth Avenue." Naomi's lips curled into a faint, almost pitying smile. You haven't changed a bit, still overcompensating for the fact that your father doesn't trust you with the company checkbook. The surrounding crowd gasped softly. Richard's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage. The mention of his father was his ultimate trigger. That's it, Richard snarled, snapping his fingers toward a nearby event coordinator. Preston, get over here right now! Preston, a highly strung event planner dressed in a velvet tuxedo, scurried over, his eyes darting nervously between Richard and Naomi. Mr. Belmont, is there a problem? Yes, there's a problem, Richard barked, pointing a manicured finger at Naomi's chest. This woman is an uninvited interloper. She has a history of harassment and unstable behavior. I want her removed from the premises immediately. Call the hotel's security. If she resists, call the NYPD. Preston looked at Naomi. He didn't recognize her as a VIP, but there was an aura of quiet, terrifying confidence about her that made him hesitate. Ma'am, Preston stammered, sweating under Richard's glare. May I please see your invitation? She doesn't have one, Victoria chimed in, crossing her arms. Just kick her out before she causes a bigger scene. Naomi calmly reached into her velvet clutch, but before she could pull out the black titanium access card, the heavy oak doors at the entrance of the grand ballroom didn't just open. They were shoved apart with a violent, echoing thud. The live jazz band, which had been softly playing a Cole Porter tune, abruptly stopped. A sudden, suffocating drop in temperature seemed to sweep across the opulent ballroom. The billionaires, politicians, and socialites, people who bowed to no one, parted like the Red Sea, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. Walking through the center of the room was a man who did not belong in their world of petty stock trades and inheritance funds. He belonged to the shadows that controlled them. His name was Alexander, ethnically Korean, but raised in the brutal, blood-soaked underworld of international syndicates. He operated purely under his Western alias in the States. He was the head of the largest ghost syndicate on the eastern seaboard. He controlled the shipping ports, the underground casinos, the luxury imports, and, quietly, half the politicians sitting in the ballroom. Alexander was breathtakingly lethal. He stood over 6 feet tall, dressed in a midnight black bespoke suit that draped perfectly over his broad, athletic frame. There was no tie, just a crisp black shirt, unbuttoned perfectly at the collar. His jawline was sharp enough to cut glass, his dark eyes like black ice, missing absolutely nothing. On his left wrist sat a piece of pure intimidation, a one-of-a-kind Richard Mille sapphire watch, a silent indicator of unimaginable, untraceable wealth. Behind him walked 4 men. They weren't standard hotel security. They were silent, broad-shouldered ghosts in tailored suits, their eyes scanning the room with the practiced calculation of professional executioners. The crowd fell dead silent. Even Richard swallowed hard, his arrogant bravado faltering for a split second. Everyone in high society knew of Alexander, even if they had never formally met him. He was the man you went to when you needed a problem permanently erased. He was the man whose bank accounts dwarfed those of the Belmont real estate empire by billions. Richard quickly adjusted his jacket, putting on his best boardroom smile. He assumed Alexander was here for some VIP backroom meeting. He stepped forward, ready to introduce himself and kiss the ring of a man who could easily fund his next high-rise project. But Alexander didn't even look at Richard. He didn't look at the senator, or the hedge fund managers, or the trembling event staff. His dark, lethal eyes were locked entirely on Naomi. The heavy, rhythmic sound of Alexander's leather shoes echoed against the marble floor as he bypassed the city's wealthiest men, as if they were invisible. He walked straight up to Naomi. The 4 terrifying men flanking him immediately fanned out, creating a protective, impenetrable perimeter around her. Alexander's cold, terrifying expression melted the second he stood in front of her. He reached out, his large, scarred hand gently tracing the side of her jaw, before resting possessively on her waist. He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her lips. Sorry I'm late, my love, Alexander murmured, his deep, gravelly voice carrying clearly through the dead silent ballroom. The meeting with the Port Authority took longer than expected. The entire ballroom stopped breathing. Victoria dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the marble floor, but no one moved to clean it up. Richard felt the blood drain completely from his face, His heart hammered violently against his ribs. My love, he thought, his mind short-circuiting. Did Alexander just kiss Naomi? Naomi smiled, leaning into Alexander's touch. It's fine, darling. I was just catching up with some old acquaintances. Alexander's gaze slowly shifted. The warmth in his eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, predatory darkness as he finally looked at Richard. The physical difference between the two men was staggering. Richard was a pampered heir who paid people to fight his battles. Alexander was a man who had built an empire over the bones of his enemies. An old acquaintance, Alexander repeated softly, the words dripping with unspoken danger. I see. Richard's brain was misfiring. His ego, deeply bruised by the sheer impossibility of the situation, pushed him to speak before his survival instincts could stop him. Mr. Alexander, Richard stammered, trying to laugh it off, though it sounded like a dying choke. There must be some kind of misunderstanding here. I think you're being played. Alexander didn't move. He didn't blink. Played? Yes, Richard insisted, stepping forward, desperately trying to reclaim his alpha status in front of the watching crowd. I know this woman. Intimately. She's my ex-wife. Naomi is a nobody from Brooklyn. She's penniless. She took me for a ride, and now she's trying to sink her claws into you. I was just having security throw her out before she embarrassed herself. One of Alexander's men, a massive enforcer, with a scar splitting his left eyebrow, took a half step forward, his hand sliding inside his suit jacket. Alexander merely raised 2 fingers. The man stopped instantly, freezing in place. The silence in the room was deafening. You could hear the hum of the crystal chandeliers. You were having security. Alexander tilted his head, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper. Throw my wife out? Richard froze. The word hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. Wife? Wife? Victoria squeaked from behind Richard, her face entirely pale. Yes, Alexander said smoothly. He pulled Naomi tighter against his side. Naomi is my wife, which makes her the co-owner of the holding company that currently owns the debt on your father's failing commercial properties, Mr. Belmont. Richard's knees went weak. The Belmont Empire had been secretly bleeding money for years. They had recently taken a massive, high-interest shadow loan to stay afloat. A loan from a private offshore firm. No, Richard breathed, his eyes darting frantically between Naomi and Alexander. That's impossible. She had nothing. I left her with nothing. You left her available, Alexander corrected, his voice slicing through the air like a razor, for which I am eternally grateful. But I do not take kindly to men who disrespect what is mine. Alexander snapped his fingers once. Immediately, the event organizer, Preston, practically materialized next to them, trembling so hard he could barely stand. Yes, Mr. Alexander? Sir? This man, Alexander said, not breaking eye contact with Richard, was just leaving. In fact, he and his +1 are permanently banned from the Pierre, banned from the Plaza, banned from the Waldorf. If I see his name on a guest list for a charity gala, a restaurant, or a cocktail lounge in my city ever again, I will burn the establishment to the ground. Am I understood? Preston nodded frantically, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. Implicitly, sir. Right away. Richard opened his mouth to protest, to scream about his rights, his money, his family name. But as he looked into Alexander's eyes, he saw absolutely no hesitation. He saw a man who could snap his neck in the middle of a crowded ballroom and walk out without a single police officer daring to stop him. Naomi, Richard whispered, looking at the woman he had abused, mocked, and discarded. He looked for mercy. He looked for the girl who used to cry when he belittled her. Naomi just looked back at him, her beautiful face a mask of absolute, regal indifference. Goodbye, Richard, she said softly. The walk from the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel to the freezing pavement of Fifth Avenue felt like a funeral march. Richard and Victoria were flanked by 3 of Alexander's massive, stone-faced enforcers who escorted them not through the VIP exit, but out the main revolving doors, directly into the glaring flashbulbs of the New York paparazzi. Word had already leaked. In the age of iPhones and instant texts, the socialite elite inside the gala had immediately messaged Page Six, TMZ, and their respective PR fixers. The headlines were writing themselves. Belmont heir, tossed from Pierre Gala by underground billionaire. Get your hands off me! Victoria shrieked, tripping over the hem of her Oscar de la Renta gown as a photographer from Getty Images aggressively snapped her tear-streaked, panicked face. Richard tried to shield his face with his tuxedo jacket, frantically waving for his Maybach, but his driver was nowhere to be found. Alexander's men stood at the top of the hotel stairs, silent sentinels, making sure the trash was taken to the curb. Richard's phone began vibrating violently in his pocket. It didn't stop for the rest of the night. By 8 a.m. the following morning, the Belmont family empire was officially bleeding out. Richard sat in the glass-walled boardroom of Belmont Holdings at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, his hands shaking as he stared at the grim faces of his father's legal team from Cravath, Swain, and more. Across the mahogany table, Richard's father, William Belmont, looked like he had aged 20 years overnight. They called in the loan. The lead attorney, a ruthless corporate shark named Davis, said, sliding a thick stack of manila folders across the table. Obsidian Capital, the offshore firm that bailed us out of the Hudson Yards development disaster last year. They invoked the morality clause and the rapid depreciation covenants. All $250 million is due within 48 hours. That's impossible! Richard slammed his fist onto the table, his voice cracking. Nobody calls in $250 million in 2 days. Tell Goldman Sachs to float us a bridge loan. Goldman Sachs isn't returning our calls, Richard, William Belmont snarled, his face purple with rage. Neither is JP Morgan. Neither is Chase. I spent the last 4 hours trying to reach our political contacts. Senator Hayes blocked my number. The mayor's office suddenly canceled our zoning meeting for the Brooklyn project. We have been entirely blacklisted overnight. William stood up, trembling with a terrifying fury, and walked over to his son. I had my private investigators look into Obsidian Capital this morning. Do you know who owns the holding company, Richard? Do you? Richard swallowed hard. The memory of Alexander's dead, black eyes flashing in his mind. Alexander? No, you idiot, William roared, slamming his palms on the table. Alexander controls the syndicate that funds it. The actual holding company, the legal entity that now owns the title to this building, the Hudson Yards project, and our family estate in Southampton, is entirely in the name of a private trust. William grabbed the top document and shoved it into Richard's chest. Read the name of the primary beneficiary. Richard's eyes darted down to the legally binding contract. His blood turned to ice. Printed in bold, undeniable ink was the name, Naomi Belmont Cho. She owns us, William whispered, his voice hollow. That woman you threw away, that woman you dragged through the mud, now holds the deed to everything our family has built for 3 generations. And because of your little stunt last night, she is liquidating it all. Richard bolted from the room, gasping for air. He needed to fix this. He needed to leverage Victoria's family money. If he could just get his father-in-law, Harrison Croft, to back them, they could fight Alexander in federal court. He burst into his Park Avenue penthouse, desperate to find his wife. Victoria! He yelled, sprinting down the hallway. He found her in the master bedroom. 4 massive Louis Vuitton trunks were open on the floor. Her personal assistant was frantically folding cashmere sweaters and silk dresses, while Victoria stood at the vanity, aggressively shoving her diamond jewelry into a velvet travel case. Vicky, thank God, Richard panted, grabbing her shoulders. I need you to call your father. We need a cash injection immediately. Things at the firm are... Victoria violently shoved his hands off her. Her blue eyes, usually soft and vacuous, were hard as flint. Don't touch me, Richard, she hissed. My father called me an hour ago. He heard what happened at the Pierre. He also heard that your company is underwater and that you pissed off the head of the Korean mafia. My father's board is terrified of the blowback. They've legally distanced Croft Enterprises from Belmont Holdings as of this morning. What? Richard stumbled back. Victoria, We're married! We're supposed to be a team! I married a billionaire, Richard. I didn't marry a bankrupt pariah with a death wish. She spat, snapping her jewelry case shut. My lawyers will be sending over the annulment papers by tomorrow. Don't ever contact me again. Within 24 hours, Richard Belmont lost his wife, his fortune, his family's legacy, and his place in society. He was entirely, devastatingly alone. 3 weeks later, the biting Manhattan wind whipped down Spring Street in Soho. Richard Belmont stood across from the ultra-exclusive French brasserie Balthazar, shivering in a wrinkled, slightly stained trench coat. He hadn't shaved in days. His credit cards had been frozen by federal investigators looking into the fraudulent valuations Belmont Holdings used to secure their initial loans, a tip conveniently dropped to the SEC by an anonymous source. He was currently sleeping on a friend's couch in Queens, though he knew he'd be kicked out soon. He had spent 2 weeks desperately tracking Naomi's movements. She was practically a ghost, moving between heavily fortified penthouses and private jets. But today, a former contact of his who worked at a luxury boutique mentioned that Naomi was having a private fitting in Soho. Richard watched as the heavy doors of Balthazar opened. Naomi stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. She looked like absolute royalty. She wore a pristine, tailored, white Max Mara cashmere coat over a charcoal turtleneck. Her dark hair, slicked back into an elegant, razor-sharp bun. She looked healthier, richer, and more powerful than she ever had during their marriage. A fleet of 3 black SUVs was idling at the curb. 2 men in dark suits immediately stepped forward to open the door of the center vehicle. But before Naomi could step inside, Richard broke from the shadows. "Naomi!" he croaked, stumbling across the sidewalk. Instantly, the atmosphere shifted. 4 armed enforcers materialized from the perimeter, their hands diving under their jackets. One of them grabbed Richard by the collar of his trench coat, slamming him violently against the brick wall of the restaurant. "Stand down," Naomi's voice cut through the tension. It was calm, authoritative, and totally devoid of fear. The guards hesitated, but slowly eased their grip, allowing Richard to slump against the wall. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath, looking up at the woman he had once tried to destroy. "Naomi, please," Richard begged, tears spilling down his hollow cheeks. "Please, I have nothing left. My father had a stroke. The feds are going to indict me on Friday. You took the company. You took the houses. You have your revenge. Please, tell Alexander to call off the feds. Just give me enough to disappear. I'm begging you." Naomi walked slowly toward him. The pristine white of her coat was a stark contrast to the grime of the city sidewalk where Richard knelt. She looked down at him, not with anger, but with the cold, clinical detachment of someone inspecting an insect. "You think Alexander did this to you?" Naomi asked softly. Richard blinked, confused. He bought the debt. He destroyed us because of what I said at the gala. Naomi let out a dark, velvety laugh that sent shivers down Richard's spine. "Alexander is a very violent, very protective man," Naomi said, crouching slightly so she was closer to his eye level. "When he saw how you treated me that night, he wanted to send a team to your penthouse and scatter your teeth across the East River. He wanted to end you physically." She tilted her head, her dark eyes flashing with a terrifying, brilliant ruthlessness. "But I told him no," she whispered. "I told him that blood washes away, but financial ruin is generational. I was the one who reviewed your father's portfolio. I was the one who noticed the fraudulent numbers on the Hudson Yards loan. I instructed Vanguard Obsidian to buy your debt 6 months ago, Richard. I was just waiting for the perfect moment to pull the trigger." Richard stared at her in absolute horror. The realization hit him like a freight train. It wasn't the mafia boss who had orchestrated his downfall. It was her, the quiet girl from Brooklyn. "I didn't just marry power, Richard," Naomi said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I became it. When you threw me out on the street with nothing, you taught me a very valuable lesson about how this world works. The strong eat the weak. I just evolved." She stood back up, smoothing out her coat. At that moment, the tinted window of the armored Rolls-Royce Phantom parked at the curb slowly rolled down. The shadows of the back seat parted, revealing Alexander's chilling, statuesque face. He didn't say a word. He just stared at Richard with eyes that promised infinite agony if Richard ever breathed near his wife again. Naomi turned and walked gracefully toward the car. Alexander extended a hand, helping her into the plush interior of the vehicle. Naomi, wait, please! Richard screamed, trying to crawl forward, but the massive boot of a Korean enforcer planted firmly on his chest, pinning him to the concrete. Naomi didn't look back. The heavy door of the Rolls-Royce clicked shut with the absolute finality of a coffin. Richard lay on the freezing sidewalk of Soho, surrounded by the bustling crowds of wealthy New Yorkers who stepped over him as if he were nothing but trash. He watched the motorcade pull away, disappearing into the labyrinth of the city, taking with it the billionaire queen he had created and leaving him in the absolute dust. What an absolutely epic tale of karma and power. Richard thought he could throw Naomi away like trash, only to find out she became the queen of his entire world. If you loved this story of ultimate revenge, high society drama, and a mafia romance that takes zero prisoners, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a good comeback story, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling, high stakes dramas every single week. See you in the next one.